Thank you for tuning in to this first episode of Call to Account. I'm Jacqui Woods.
And I'm Paul Croft.
And we are directors at BRI Ferrier's Forensic Accounting Practice. This is a first in a series of episodes in which we'd like to talk to you about all things forensic accounting.
So how are you feeling today, Jacqui? Our first episode.
Yeah, so I'm a bit nervous, Paul. I'm not really one for speaking and filming myself.
Of course not, no, I know. But we'll give it a good whirl.
We will give it a good go. So, Paul, what will we talk about today for this first episode?
Look, I thought today we would talk about insolvency and a director's duty to prevent a company from trading whilst insolvent, and also be sharing some insights I've got from a case I was personally involved with, being the Dick Smith insolvent trading litigation. Now I thought, this is a great topic for our first episode. We've gone through 12 months of COVID. 12 months ago, businesses were hit with this sudden shock, put under a great deal of financial stress, and have been battling through over the last 12 months. That has been softened to a degree by high levels of government support. However, since over the last 6 months, that support has been gradually wound back and will pretty much cease at the end of this month, being March. So for those businesses that may be finding it difficult and maybe in that grey area in terms of will I continue or not, now is the time for the directors of those companies to really reassess the ongoing solvency and viability of their companies.
Well, I hope that's going to be useful for the audience, Paul, but it's a very broad topic to cover.
It is, and I don't intend to cover everything insolvency in today's episode. However, what I thought we could do instead was focus on a question that was put to me during the Dick Smith investigation. And that question was, surely the directors knew or ought to have known that the company was insolvent or at risk of becoming insolvent?
And that's a pretty fair question, isn't it? And it's something that we're always asked when we're asked to investigate claims of insolvent trading.
And no matter how many times I hear it, it always gets my hackles up.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. It's just that question is generally asked with a great deal of hindsight. And as we know, when you've got hindsight, you've got perfect 20/20 vision. But when you're in the middle of an unfolding crisis, like a particular insolvency event or the slide towards insolvency, it's quite possible the directors might miss those warning signs, the indicators of insolvency. And they might miss those because they might unfold over time. They might occur in isolation, they might be random or non-linear events. And when I talk about indicators of insolvency, I'm talking about things like a supplier putting a business on cash on deposit, or cash on delivery, and that might happen 1 month and not occur for another 3 months. Or that, from time to time, a business may need to put its suppliers or defer some payments to suppliers. And of course that might, and because those events or those instances happen sporadically, they may be missed as indicators of insolvency.
Yes, well that's interesting, Paul, and interesting also that you describe it as an unfolding crisis. I haven't really thought about it that way before.
And to be honest, I hadn't thought about it this way until I was actually started preparing for this podcast, for this series today. And look, the reason I like thinking about it in terms of an unfolding crisis is for two main reasons. First of all, I've talked about the warning signs that lead into a crisis. So it reinforces the need for companies to have effective management reporting systems and processes so that those warning signs, those indicators of insolvency are surfaced and elevated to the directors and to the board in a timely fashion. And the other reason I like to think about insolvency as an unfolding crisis is because there are two phases typically to a crisis. One is the emergency phase, and the other is the adaptation phase. Both of those phases have their own sort of framework for responses, and both must be worked on together to ensure that a company can emerge from the crisis in a stronger position.
That's interesting too. And coming back to management reporting systems and processes, if you had to choose just one, what would be the number one tool in the management toolbox to manage a company's solvency?
First of all, I like the way you describe it as a toolbox because there are a lot of tools.
Yeah.
Some of those tools are for managing short-term versus long-term liquidity or solvency or whatever. But for me, I'd have to say that rolling 13-week monthly cash flow forecasts, they're updated on a monthly basis, sit at the top of my list.
So 13-week forecasts updated on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and look, and I say that for three primary reasons. First of all, there's the obvious. They help a company and the directors manage the cash flows of the business. They help identify things like liquidity crunches or any sort of short-term operating challenges. Secondly, because they are done on a 13-week basis and updated monthly, they're constantly having to be updated and assumptions changed as the trading environment changes. So if all of a sudden, you went from physical sales to online sales, how does a company respond to that? So they're a great way for managing volatility and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And thirdly, and leading on from that second point, because you are having to constantly update them and update your assumptions, you're constantly having to update your knowledge of the company's trading and operating environment, which means that the directors must be constantly facing or forced to look at fundamental questions about the ongoing nature of their business and whether it's actually fit for purpose in the current environment.
Absolutely, and I really like your third point, because it seems to me that now, if not already through the COVID year we've just had, directors must be questioning the permanent impacts that COVID has had on them and what might happen in the future, such as impacts on the company's supply chain, customer behaviours, customer buying patterns, and taking those insights and building them into cash flow forecasting so that they can actually build and follow and manage a company's cash flow. Because if they don't do that, then they run the risk of just doing what they've done before and falling into that old adage of doing the same thing over and over again is the sign of madness. And clearly, may take the company down the path towards the unfolding crisis of an insolvency event.
And look, I totally agree with you, but I just want to also make it clear that if you have missed the warning signs, and it's quite easy to do, as I've said, then it's not too late.
Yeah.
So, what you might do is find yourself in the middle of your emergency phase of your unfolding crisis. Now, this is the phase in which the directors need to take the right sort of actions that stabilise the company and then buy a bit of time for them. And I'll talk about why it's important to buy some time in a moment. Now, coming back to the Dick Smith case that I was involved with, when the directors found themselves in the middle of their emergency crisis around January, February 2015, I believe, this is just, my perspective, they seem to take the right sort of actions that directors should take in the middle of an emergency phase. So firstly, they resisted the urge to fall back on default options and quick fixes, such as across the board cost reductions, staff redundancies. Now, I'm not saying that those sort of quick fixes don't have a place. They will always have a place.
Yes.
But the important thing is when you are going for those knee-jerk reactions, you've got to also consider the long-term viability of a company. So if you are in the middle of the emergency phase and you want to emerge stronger, by taking some of these quick fixes may impair or undermine the longer-term or the ongoing viability of the company. So just, if you are going to do it, just be aware of that.
Yeah.
And the second key insight I had from their emergency phase, was the directors developed and implemented a carefully considered, time-bound working capital management strategy that focused on reducing the creditors, reducing the levels of high stock obsolescence, and generating sufficient cash flows to keep the business going. Now, they did that really well. They did that within the time limits that they set. So, for me, full marks to their management of the emergency crisis.
Well, isn't that interesting that you thought they did that really well and top marks, but as we know, they still went into liquidation. So what on earth went wrong?
So, look, firstly, let me just say that it's never easy to point to the real underlying causes of insolvency. You can talk about the symptoms of that. So, the symptoms might be, if you're an analyst, you might say that there was, high levels of stock obsolescence. Purchasing wasn't necessarily as targeted as it should have been. There may have been issues around culture in terms of stock purchasing and remuneration. There may have been issues around accounting. So there's a whole lot of factors that may have contributed to it. But I wouldn't necessarily say they were the underlying causes of the insolvency. Now, from a crisis management perspective, I would suggest that the directors didn't necessarily fully engage with the second phase of an unfolding crisis, being the adaptation phase.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is the phase where the directors spend the time that was bought during the first phase to investigate and fully understand the root causes that led to the crisis emerging in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and then they take those learnings and they develop and build the right sort of systems, processes and frameworks to ensure that the company can continue or can now compete in the new economic reality. So, to give the directors, the Dick Smith directors, credit, what they did do, they focused very much on just one of those issues, and did a lot of work around stock management. But they didn't consider the broader issues that contributed to the insolvency. And so because they didn't actually understand and remediate the issues that led to the crisis in the first place, they re-emerged during the second half of calendar year 2015. The same mistakes were repeated, and as you point out, the rest is history. It became insolvent.
Absolutely. So, well, that's really interesting, Paul. Thank you. And as we know, the Dick Smith litigation is done and dusted, and we're awaiting judgment to be handed down. And one of those issues within the judgment will be finally some court testing of Section
254T of the Corps Act, which really is looking at the impact of paying a dividend on creditors, another director's duty which has been so far, as you point out, untested.
Yes. So we're looking forward to seeing how that transpires, and indeed there will be an episode on that in due course. But the message today, folks, is cash is king. You can make your balance sheet as strong as you want it to look, but if it includes stock, which has got a major element of obsolescence, if it includes debtors that are not recoverable, then of course the cash is not going to flow. So hence the toolbox tip, 13-week cash flows, manage your solvency.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.